Let me explain my title there. So I went to Xavier University undergraduate, then I went to UC Med, but then I was in the military, active duty for 9 years, and I got to sent to some nice places. I was in Hawaii as an intern in Honolulu, Tripler, and then I went to Denver, Fitzsimmons for 2 years as a resident. Then I went to Walter Reed in Washington, D.C. as a rheumatology fellow. And then I spent 4 years at Fort Knox. Then I left active duty, stayed in the reserves, and went and started my practice in 1986. And we've grown from myself, one rheumatologist. We just added this week our 6th rheumatologist in northern Kentucky. So we're the largest single specialty rheumatology group. I guess we're tied in the state of Kentucky. At the same time, I stayed in the reserves because I already had 12 years in. And I got called up to Desert Storm in 1990. And my first partner just joined me that August, lucky for me. I went over to Saudi Arabia, was there for 6 months, came home, and continued on the practice group. We realized there was a crisis in education and that it was impossible to homeschool all 7 of our children at home. So we thought it would be easier to start a school. So in 1997, we started a small school with 15 students. We've slowly grown. Now we're at 43, grades 1 through 12. We've graduated 19 students from our school so far. We've had 2 National Merit finalists. We now have 2 of our graduates in the seminary at the Josephinum. One of our teachers who was with us 2 years is now in the seminary for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And one of our teachers is now a cloistered Dominican in the South. So that's been some of the things that we've done. I've been involved in a pro-life cause actually since I got back to Cincinnati, and I'm on the board of Northern Kentucky Right to Life, mostly through the agency of my wife, who has dragged me to all these things and kind of forced me to do all these things. So they say behind every mediocre male there's a great woman, and that's my wife. I've been asked to talk about the illogic. Actually, I wasn't asked to talk. I proposed this topic last year because last year I talked about the logic of the pro-life position. And I thought, in contradistinction, that I think we should kind of review the illogic of the pro-abortion position, or as I say, the evil logic of the abortionists. So that's what we're going to talk about for about 30 minutes this morning. Next slide. I can't overemphasize this, and this will probably be one of the big takeaway messages, is the central importance of the premise. What's a premise? A premise is either the given, it's the principle, it's the presupposition. It's where we begin. Okay, you have to begin somewhere, and that somewhere can appear to be somewhat arbitrary. So we have to root it in some fundamental. And so we're going to go over some of these premises and see where they lead us. Then you take logic. You take your premise, you add logic, and that will pretty much determine your conclusion. So the problem is if you have a wrong premise, you will end up in the wrong place. Next slide. So, what we want to do is change some of these. So the implications of a wrong premise is that if we want to change the conclusion, what do we have to do? We need to change the premise. And that's not an easy process. If a person's completely uninformed and you present it to them in a reasonable way, they may accept it. But if they already have a premise as a given, it's really a matter of conversion or metanoia. And this will require our patience and our persistence and clarity. And actually, I think our example, our personal example in our lives is what will help people change their premises. So let's look at just a short review of what we talked about last year, the pro-life principles. So let's look at that slide. So the first principle we have is that all human life is sacred. Now some people don't like the word sacred, it has too much of a religious tone, so we say dignified or endowed with dignity. Or there's a specialness, a uniqueness to the human person, okay? Human life. So that's our first premise. Our second premise is that human life begins at fertilization. We're going to go into this in a little more depth. But this is a scientific statement of reality, in fact. It's denied across the board by many people, but this is reality. We say it is always wrong to take innocent human life, and we say it is not permitted to do evil, even if good may come of it. Okay, next slide. So, if we have these principles, they compel us to certain conclusions. The first conclusion is then that abortion is always wrong. Even in the cases of rape or incest, even if the child is unwanted, even if the child has physical abnormalities, even if the mother's life is in danger, but understanding the principle of double effect. If the mother dies, so does the child. So obviously, we do everything we can to save both. And the problem is these principles leave no room for compromise without violating the very principles we started with. So that's the issue with principles. As an aside, I was at a conference, the Catholic Medical Association, and they had 3 speakers. And they were talking about the similarity of morality among Jews, Catholics, and Muslims. And so they had 3 physicians who gave 3 talks explaining about their moral tradition. But it was a little confusing when the Muslim talked, because at the end he said, "These are our principles, except in cases of necessity." I said, "What does that mean?" Well, he said, in case something really hard came up, then, of course, we wouldn't employ these principles. I said, "Well, then it's not a principle." But he couldn't get that, and so actually I talked to him later for about 15 minutes, and no, he said, no, that's what I would say over and over again. No, in case of necessity, no. Sometimes your hand's forced, you have to. I said, well, then you violate your principle. He said, no, we're allowed that. And I said, no. I kind of walked away with saying, I don't know if I can deal with you, so, or any of your. All right, well, anyway, so that's just a simple review of our pro-life principles. And so now I want to look at the next slide, the pro-abortion principles. Now remember, this comes from a pro-lifer trying to analyze theirs. So some people may say, oh, this is not really what our principles are, but I think we can tease out their principles. So in counter-reflection to what I've just stated, pro-abortion principles would have to be these. Number 1, that all human life is not sacred or dignified or special. Only some. 2, human life does not begin at fertilization. Number 3, it is only occasionally wrong to take innocent human life. And 4, one can do evil that good may come of it, sometimes. So, let's look at these in a little more depth and see. So, next slide. So, number 1, all human life is not sacred. Remember, these are the pro-abortion principles. So, how does one decide which life is sacred, dignified, special, allowed to have protection? How do we decide it? Well, let's see what they say. So, if the human life is in utero, the mother decides. The father really has no legal standing. If the mother decides in life, father must pay child support the child. If the mother decides against life, father has no say. Can't really prevent that act from happening. And I consider this illogical. This doesn't make sense to me. That the 2 people that are party to the pregnancy, although the woman carries the greater burden, still that makes no sense to me, that the father can have no say and that it would only be based on the mother's say. However, next slide, if we're talking ex utero, so the child has been born, the child's life is protected. Of course, you have Peter Singer and others who say, well, really, it should still be conditional until about the first year. You got to see how the kid's doing. So if the kid develops some abnormalities or struggles to live, and maybe it would be permissible to let that child die or euthanize that child. Kermit Gosnell was sentenced to life in prison. Actually, he avoided a possibility of the death sentence by pleading and got sentenced to life in prison without parole for killing babies that had just been born and were alive. So society says, once it's outside of the uterus, then all these lives are going. So really, what is so special about the uterus that inside the child can be, so outside the child must be saved? And I think that is illogical. The life inside the uterus is not protected, but outside is protected. Makes, once again, no sense to me. So these are the contortions that bad principles lead you to. Next. So I don't think that the uterus, not that it isn't special, it carries human life, but it's not special from a legal point of view. It seems to be illogical, and that these conclusions are illogical. Okay, so the supporters now, realizing the illogic, will attempt to make it logical by stating to bring their principle in conformity with logic. Handicapped children ex utero can be killed. And the next step will be chronically ill people can be killed. And that the feeble, dependent, elderly can be killed. Under that principle that human life is not sacred from fertilization to natural death, all of these conclusions will be forced upon these people, all based on the fact that they want to kill the child in the uterus. So if you follow out the logic, these are going to be the natural conclusions that those people will be forced to, because logic will compel them to these conclusions based on their stated premise. Now let's look at the next principle. Principle number 2. Human life does not begin at fertilization. Now this is just absolutely, simply untrue. And I've talked at a med school, and I've talked to the pro-life people at UC, and there were some people that came to heckle, and they really can't get this. Now, in the 21st century, it's hard for me to believe that people don't get this absolute biologic reality. So it's simply untrue. However, to avoid invoking principle number 1, which is pretty stark principle, the pro-boards declare that the fetus is not human. So they're forced to say this. Next slide. So what's the basic biology? Well, we're naturally infertile. And actually, I heard a talk about a year ago about marriage, and the lady who gave the talk, it seems profoundly simple and obvious, but I had never quite thought of it this way. But naturally, a male and naturally a female alone is infertile. It's the combination of the two that produces a new, unique individual. So when a human sperm from a male combines with a human ovum of a female, it results in a fertilized human, a pure fertilized ovum. And this fertilized ovum begins to divide and is alive. That's a biologic reality. Next slide. And male and female human begets a human. Like I tell people, if you were a horse racing mogul, and you paid $50,000 a stud fee, you're expecting a horse. You're not thinking I might get a rutabaga. No, you paid $50K, I'm getting a horse. So there's nobody in the horse breeding community who thinks it's going to be anything but a horse. That's the biologic reality. But in our normal daily parlance, we talk about a test tube baby. So when they conceive outside within a test tube, no one thinks it's not a human. You know, when they talk about using frozen human embryos, they don't have cat embryos or monkey. When they talk about human embryonic stem cells, they're not saying that, oh, I said, well, why do you call that human? Why don't you just use a cat embryo? These aren't human. Why do you want those? Well, because it's obvious that humans beget humans. From the very beginning, it's a human being. So let's look at the natural stages of human life. So what do we have? Well, you start with it as a first. We all started this way. Every single person ever started fertilized ovum, then a blastocyst, then an embryo, then a fetus, then a baby, then an infant, child, adolescent, adult, and elder. That is the natural stages of human development. At no stage in this biologically is it not human. At no stage. At every stage it's human. If any single stage is interrupted, then the unique human individual dies. At every stage, it is human. Now, this is the reality. So how can someone look you in the face and tell you other than that? Because they understand that if they grant this premise, they lose the argument. So they will not concede this premise, regardless of what the actual factual evidence demonstrates. Next slide. So why, as I say, why do these pro-abortion advocates deny this obvious, commonsensical, biologic reality? Because if they concede this, they must rely on principles, principle number one, it's just too stark for them to face. And so they're going to go after this, which is a lie. So that brings me a slight aside here, the big lie. Society is now really being controlled and manipulated by the big lie. Not just, this is one of the big lies, that the fetus is not human. That's a lie. But people operate on that, and they take that as a premise. But there's others out there. Women are the same as men. Homosexuality is normal. Sex is not sacred. Islam is a religion of peace. I could go on. There's hundreds of them. Okay? Many, many more. If you accept these as a premise, that drives you to certain conclusions, and that becomes a big problem for society. Next slide. So when you accept the big lie as a premise, it will change your conclusions, it will cause you to violate or ignore common sense and empirical reality, and it causes cognitive dissonance. So if you talk with these people, they're never at peace. They can't be at peace. Why? Because they're trying to hold the contradictions in their head. It can't be done. That's a very delicate balance. So why do you think, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience, I've had many times, I kind of have a loud voice, so maybe that's why, but I'll be talking the pro-abortion position and somebody will come over and get in my face. And I said, whoa, I'm not talking to you. What small stimulus would evoke such a violent response? And I tell you what, it's this cognitive dissonance. You have now destabilized this delicate balance. They can't stand it. I think it's really true about homosexuality. That's why they want to suppress all discussion about homosexuality as morally wrong. Because they try and live with cognitive dissonance, with these contradictions in their head. And they don't want to hear anyone disagreeing because it destabilizes them, emotionally upsets them. So it's not an intellectual argument anymore, it's an emotional problem. So be aware of that. Next slide. What are some historical examples of society accepting the big lie and pro-abortion principles? Well, the French Revolution, I think, is the modern origin of almost all the evils in society. Obviously, it goes back to the devil, but the French Revolution unleashed a terrible evil in Europe. I don't think Europe's ever recovered from it. We were somewhat isolated from it for a long time, but we saw it kind of surface in the 60s. Nazi Germany, based on the big lie. Communist Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, Communist China. What's the results? Take the big lie, or big lies, millions of innocent people die. That's what happens. When you fly from the truth, and who's the truth? That's a person. That's the second person of the Trinity. That's Christ. You flee the truth, you get hell on earth. Let's look at the third principle. It is not always wrong to take innocent human life. So occasionally, as the Muslim told me, in case of necessity, okay? In case of necessity, you can blow yourself up, lie to an infidel, do whatever. You can pretend to be a Christian if you're in the West until you can undermine them. So in case of necessity. If a fetus is not human, we can destroy it without guilt. So taking principle number 2. But we did demonstrate that it's human. Therefore, the pro-boards now have to say that it is the right of the mother to decide, okay? Reassuring her that any decision is morally correct. So that's what they do. So they have to do that. So they're going to fob that off. They'll say it's not human. They'll fob it off on the mother who's under stress to make that decision. Next slide. And it's kind of an anomaly in our society today, and this is somewhat of an extraordinary exception. So civil society has established elaborate procedure to protect the innocent. So we have a judge and jury, lawyers for defense and prosecution. It's open to the public. We have a code of law. There's right of appeal, almost right of endless appeal. So we've set up this big superstructure to make sure that the innocent are protected and only the guilty are punished. And we say, let 10 guilty go free so that we don't punish one innocent. However, next slide, in one situation, the pregnant mother is allowed to decide the fate of the child in this one situation. And this is illogical and it violates other areas of the civil law that recognize the humanity of the fetus. So for instance, in torts, if you're pregnant and you're in a car accident, the child can sue for damages. If your father dies before you're born, you still have the right of inheritance. If a pregnant woman is murdered, in many states now it's considered a double homicide. So we have these recognitions in the law of the right and humanity, the rights and humanity of the fetus, which is ignored in this one exception. And finally, it brings us to principle number 4, that in case of necessity, one can kill or end the human life, that one may do evil that good may come of it. And so the woman sometimes will say, I cannot kill or end the human life in my body so that, and then pick your excuse. Well, my education, I need to finish my education. I can continue my career without interruption. I won't need to get married. I can avoid embarrassment. I can avoid the expense of having a child. So these are all the things that you hear. You hear the president say this. Well, let's apply this principle, next slide, to the other areas. Well, what do they say? The definition of chutzpah. You murder your parents and you claim mercy court because you're an orphan. Okay, so that's chutzpah. But you kill your parents for the inheritance. Now everyone thinks, well, that's so far-fetched. That is so far-fetched. Now imagine a state like Washington or Oregon where you are allowed to be euthanized. Now who's going to advise you? Well, probably your children, right? Now let's see. They say, well, Dad, you're a little bit feeble now. And that nursing home's costing us about $4,000 a month. You only got $250,000 left, and if you live another couple of years, all that money will be gone. So, you know, you've lived a good life. Why don't you take the medicine? So that, we're going to have to deal with this. Well, I mean, we're already dealing with this. So, and everybody says, oh, no, I love them, all that there's nothing to do with the money. Don't believe it. You know, so that's going to be a big issue in the future. And in fact, now with the Obamacare and reform, I think that there are going to be ages where you'll be cut off from care. So I think that's coming too. So that's under that principle. How about kill the handicapped or avoid the expensive maintenance? That's coming. That's coming. Human life is not sacred. We can do anything we want. So you're a big burden on the state. Would you rather end your suffering? Now they're euthanizing them. Kids can ask to be euthanized in Holland. How about experiment on people without their consent so that we can cure cancer? That seems like a good thing, right? And so, what's going to happen? You know, the Germans did medical experiments on Jewish prisoners. And their logic was really flawless. They're going to die anyways, because we're going to kill them. So why not get some use out of them before we kill them? That was their logic. Kind of nice, closed system. So they experimented on it. When we won the war, that experimental data was handed over to the Americans. They burned it. They said it was ill-gotten, so it was destroyed. That's what you need to do. That's an ill-gotten gain. You can't take that. So, what about the future? So based on these principles, i.e. the pro-abortion principles, let us envision our future society. 1, the strong will prey on the weak. The majority will subjugate the minority. Rights will be conditional. Truth will be displaced by the big lie. God's law will be ignored. And our human nature will be both denied and forsaken. Next slide. So I have 2 examples that I want to talk just about our human nature. And you decide, you know, these were kind of some raw data that I was exposed to. One day in my office, in the morning, I had 2 different female patients, 20, 30 minutes apart. The first one came in and she had some osteoarthritis knee, and we were talking. I said, anything recently happened unusual? She said, well, I had an abortion. I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. She said, well, it was my 3rd abortion. So I'm sorry to hear that. She said, I don't feel anything about that. I don't feel bad about that at all. You know, I said, well, why do you keep saying you're sorry about that? I said, well, I think that's just a bad thing. Well, no, I don't think it is. So that was one patient. About 30 minutes later, another patient comes in. A young female, married, in her 20s, late 20s, and she had just had a miscarriage. And it was like her 2nd miscarriage. And she was almost, could not be consoled. She was crying and upset that she had lost her child. Talked about losing my baby. She was a couple months pregnant. She was very distraught. So my question to you is, those are contradictory positions. No guilt, no feeling, no empathy, nothing, and one emotionally devastated. Which one do you think reflects the true human female nature? Which one does? Yeah, that's what I think. It can't be both. I mean, we see both, but one is the perversion of the true reality. One night I was working in an emergency room. I had just been to the Right to Life conference in Northern Kentucky. And I was talking to another nurse about it. And we're talking. And some other nurse way over here, this is what I'm talking about, these overreactions, comes running up to me and points her finger at me and says, Dr. Kunath, you have no right to talk about abortion. You're not a woman, and I'm not going to talk to you again. I turned to the other nurse and said, who put a burr under her saddle? You know, she goes scurrying off. All right. So now the shift's 12 hours long. So that was like at 9. Now it's 2 in the morning. I'm writing up a chart. And that nurse that just told me she would never talk to me again, she comes up, she's standing over as I'm sitting there writing. What do you think she tells me? What do you think she tells me? She had an abortion. Now, first off, I'm her declared enemy. But now she wants to talk to me. So she talks to me about she had an abortion. She was engaged with her husband. She got pregnant. They decided to have an abortion. And she says, I never think about it. She had 2 more. Yeah, okay, so okay, that's not reality. Anyway, so she had 2 more children. But I remember, and I reflected on, I heard her talk about her husband in the past. She was a nurse. She was the big breadwinner. He taught PE at some public schools, so didn't bring in a lot of money. And she always kind of talked in a tone of disparagement about him. And with that new piece of information, I thought, I wonder that he didn't stand up for her. And she felt betrayed. Well, anyways, 2 years later, they ended up divorced. She ended up moving to Arizona, and she ended up calling back to the ER about 5 years later to talk to some of her old nurse friends. And when she finished talking to her nurse friends, she said, and would you tell Dr. Kunath I'm doing okay? So when somebody tells you, I don't think about it, that's not your human nature. You have to conform things to your human nature. So those are 2 examples I think demonstrate our human nature. And you have to extract it from your observations. But if you have those kind of things in your head, you'll be able to kind of understand this phenomenon. And finally, my conclusions. So we need to change these premises. Okay? We need to get people to see the truth and validity of these premises, really rooted in the truth, which is Christ, rooted in the church, rooted in the ultimate reality, which is a spiritual reality. So we have to pray for our opponents. We have to identify our opponent's principles, and we want to point out their horrific potential. What is one of the most horrifying things is I've done this now, and when you point out the potential, it doesn't upset anybody. It's almost like, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, we'll get rid of the handicap. We'll get rid of the elderly. Yeah, save us money. So it's getting to be a little bit scary. We ourselves have to live by our pro-life principles, and we have to teach these to others, mostly by our example and occasionally with our words. Okay, it's the demonstration of our own lives that will persuade. Problem is, that's a long project. You know, so I like to argue with people, and so I would like to argue with them, you know, and demonstrate that my principles are better and my logic's more compelling, or the logic is more compelling. And I find out that isn't all that effective. You know, it polarizes, you don't get to transmit. So I try to take a more tempered, maybe more Socratic approach by asking them, trying to draw out what their own principles are, and then just trying to maybe slightly more gently point out the possible terrible implications of that. And then in the end, I think we have to believe that life will triumph over death. You know, we know that to be the ultimate truth. We know that Christ conquered death, and that in the end, our principles will out, but it may not be in our lifetime. I thank you for your attention. Do we entertain questions or? Okay, some questions. We have a few minutes. Any questions? It's early. Yes?
Good. Have you, I do pro-life work, and in the emails and different resources I get, there's actually and it's probably a small component, but I think it's growing, of pro-abortionists who are probably as extreme in their belief as I am in my belief, who will say, yes, it is a baby, yes, it's a human being, and so what?
That's right. So now they're back to principle one. Yep.
There are two lives, and the woman's life trumps the other life. That's their conclusion, is that the woman's life has greater, they won't say value, they'll simply say the woman's decision is the woman's, but they.
No, that's exactly
They
right. Oh,
acknowledge
yeah.
it's a baby, it's a human being,
Yeah.
yes, okay.
Well, I never got that far. When I gave the pro-life talk, or pro-life principle talk, I gave it at UC, and a group of 4 opponents were there to ask questions. And at first I thought, well, maybe we'll have an exchange of ideas, but that was their trump card, that their answer to everything is the mother decides. The mother decides. The mother gets to decide. And so I couldn't really penetrate that. And so I went on with the talk, and then they asked some more questions. And I said, that's fine. I said, give me your premise. What is your premise then? I know that, I said, that mother decides is your conclusion. What's the premise that's based on? Well, they couldn't give me the premise, or they didn't want to give me the premise. So finally, 2 of them got up, called me a nasty name, and walked out. So that's kind of where it ends often, and that's a problem. So I think we have to force them back to, well, what's the premise? Why we don't let the mother decide on all these. In fact, she can't decide to be a prostitute. That's against the law. So she can't use her body. She can't inject drugs, because that's against the law. She can do it, but it's against the law. It's illegal, and we also consider it immoral. But why in this particular case do we allow that in absolute? Because they have to have the dead kid. They got to get the kid dead, okay, whatever it takes. And I think a lot of them have, so there was not really a monitor, there was a professor at this talk at UC, and he told, at the end, he jumped in, and he said he was neutral and actually leaning towards a pro-abort position, but at the end he said, well, this logic, he said, and I might have to rethink it some. And I think we have to be clear in where we're going, what are the conclusions. So it's a difficult area, because what you really bump into is it's not this dispassionate, let's go over to principles. What happens is it's an emotional thing. And realize, what do they say? 2/3 of Americans are in some way touched by abortion. Somebody they knew or somebody had. So you're treading on some delicate land there where it can blow up. So, yes.
Yeah, statistical analysis is telling us that more and more people are self-identifying as pro-life. And yet at the same time, we have statistical increases saying more and more people say that abortion is not wrong in every circumstance. And it sounds a lot like your situation with the Muslim doctor, but I'm wondering if you could reflect on that and give some suggestions as to how we, as pro-lifers, respond.
So what we have to do is explain the principle. So I think you just walk them through the logic. This is why I am compelled to this conclusion, because these 4 principles compel me that in every case we cannot take the human life. The one that will get you, so most people actually will concede rape, incest, once you beat them a little bit, they usually will concede those. What they won't concede is the life of the mother, however defined. And so I tell people, now you have to understand the double effect. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not that skilled in this, but you say, let's face it, the logic is the mother dies, kid dies. Got to save both, okay? And then in case of ectopic pregnancy, we have a moral principle of the double effect. We can save the mother's life by removing the diseased tissue, the unintended consequence of which is that the child will die. The same way with chemotherapy. If you have cancer and you're pregnant, you can't do an abortion. Now, the doctors want to do an abortion because they say your immunity's down and cancer, but you can't take the chemo because the chemo is designed to kill the tumor. And we know as an unavoidable side effect, it will harm the child. And the church has now recognized several women who have foregone chemo, which they were entitled to, so that the child will not be harmed. And they subsequently died, the child was saved. So we do see that. So that's going to be a difficult area, but I think we try and get them to, we have to show them the logic and how it compels the conclusion. So that's the best we can. Yes?
I noticed that she was talking about the pro-abort, increasing pro-abort position that, the mother decides. Well, that's also, I think it was MSNBC a few months ago, one of the presenters essentially that was the trump card she threw.
No, it is, and you'll see it, that's because, and I'll tell you where it's coming from, it's the schools. It's all the schools, and that's just pumped into everybody. And so that's where these conclusions come from, that's how they've been taught, they've been given this premise. So the premise, and I tell them that's a conclusion, mother decides based on what premise. So you gotta kind of force them to that, and they don't like to be forced to, well, how is it that woman, in what sense? The woman is more important, like you say, they won't say that. You say, what premise is this?
In the life, I was in that situation with my son. He was 3 months early, but I had got severe preeclampsia and had verge of dying. And even in that state and under drugs, they were like, you need to sign this. And my conclusion on my statement was, you do whatever you have to do to save my baby. Because I think God writes it on the heart of a mother.
Absolutely.
To lay her life down for her child. If
Right.
I'm in a burning building and only
Right.
one of us can
Right.
escape, my baby's going out the door,
Right.
my child's
Right.
going out the door,
Right.
not me.
So I think that's a reflection of the true motherly nature. I just think it is. And I'm going to tell you though, I see that being suppressed everywhere you look. Those natural tendencies in the female are being suppressed across society. I talked to a lady the other day, new patient. She runs a daycare. Starts at 6 in the morning, goes to 12 at night, 12 midnight. Now, what do you make of that? Oh my God, you know how terrible that is? Now maybe that's where people work second shift. I don't know, I didn't ask her, but I thought, oh my God, 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. So bad. Yeah.
I'm concerned about the issue of experimental drugs. Say for instance, like a person has cancer and they've tried all the regular treatments and they got no results.
Right.
Can this person volunteer to use?
Absolutely. It's only when it's coerced and you don't solicit their agreement. The violation of the personhood is not to elicit their cooperation. So when you experiment on a Jewish person in a prison camp, you don't get his, or you're walking down the street in China or India, they knock you on the head, you wake up and your kidney's been removed. So that's immoral. But no, absolutely, and that's quite legitimate. You can expose yourself to unknown or uncertain dangers willingly, and that's acceptable and completely morally licit, no problem.
Even if they tell you there's a possibility that you might die?
Yes, indeed, you can do that. Because if too many people die, there's that drug. And it probably wouldn't have got out of phase 2 testing, so you're talking mostly phase 3, but sometimes phase 2. And there is some danger, but if the balance is too much, it is potentially lethal, they're not going to be using that drug. But yeah, there always is unexpected consequences. Usually they have a good idea, but when you run it out, you see that people have problems. Everyone's a little different. Very good. Thank you very much for your attention.